My name is Cody Turner. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at Bentley University. I was a postdoc at the IEET last year. That's where Jay and I came into contact. And today we're going to be starting with the panel on human enhancement. And we're going to be talking for 90 minutes or so, probably the first 70 minutes conversation, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And like I said over email, I want this conversation to be very open-ended, kind of podcast style. Feel free to respond to one another in real time. You don't have to wait for me to ask a question. And with that, I will introduce the panelists. So first we have Anders Sandberg. He's a researcher at the Mimir Center for Long-Term Futures Research in Stockholm and formerly of Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute. A self-described academic jack of all trades and one of the most prominent voices in the transhumanist intellectual tradition, as Jay was discussing. He's written on a whole range of topics from transhumanism, cognitive enhancement, whole brain emulation, existential risk, and more. We also have Lílian Santos, an associate professor of bioethics at the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum. Apologies if I mispronounced anything there. Lílian is a research scholar at the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights. Her recent book with Springer examines the governance of human gene editing and proposes a proportionality-based alternative to the traditional therapy versus enhancement distinction, which I'd like to get into on this panel. And then last but not least, we have Massimo Reichlin, who's a full professor of moral philosophy and the dean of faculty of philosophy at the Università Vita Salù San Raffaele in Milan. He works in bioethics and moral philosophy in the Kantian tradition and is known in the enhancement debate for his argument that biotechnological and moral enhancement threatens our capacity for authentic moral agency, which I also want to get into more on this panel. So let's give a hand for our panelists before we jump into the discussion. So I want to start with the traditional therapy versus enhancement distinction and then move into questions surrounding governance of human enhancement. And before I ask the first questions to the panelists, I want to just kind of set the stage and make a few preliminary distinctions with which most members of the audience are probably familiar with. So first, the traditional distinction between enhancement and therapy, right? Therapy is traditionally construed as restoring some capacity, whereas enhancement is going beyond that capacity. And traditionally, therapy is seen as more acceptable, whereas enhancement is more morally suspect, right, at the very least. So that's the traditional distinction. There is, and this is something else I want to explore in the panel, a kind of question as to whether there's a sharp boundary between enhancement and therapy, and there's not, right? There's tons of gray area cases which we can talk about. So like one example would be transcranial direct current stimulation, which is a non-invasive form of neuromodulation, typically used for things like depression, but people are starting to explore its enhancement capacities for improving working memory, for example. So you can imagine someone with, borderline cognitive impairment or dementia. That kind of person uses transcranial direct current stimulation. Is that a form of therapy or is it a form of enhancement? And my sense is that there's no objective answer to that question because the boundary between therapy and enhancement is objectively fuzzy. And so I want to kind of explore those gray area cases as well. A few other words just to kind of set the stage here. There are different kinds of enhancement, obviously. There's cognitive enhancement, so you can enhance your attention, you can enhance your memory, you can enhance your reasoning capacities. There's affective enhancement, you can enhance your moods or emotions. There's physical enhancement, just enhancing your physical strength or your sensory acuity. And then there's moral enhancement, which is something I also want to talk about briefly on the panel, right? Enhancing your capacity to be a better person, essentially. And all of these different kinds of enhancement aren't mutually exclusive, right? There's some kind of intervention which makes you less impulsive, that could be construed as a form of cognitive enhancement, it could be construed as a form of effective enhancement, and possibly even moral enhancement as well. Last distinction I want to make, just to set the stage before we get into the questioning, the distinction between, and this is something that I know Anders has written on, the distinction between conventional versus unconventional enhancement. And so conventional enhancement being things that are typically widely accepted, right? Like caffeine, education. Non-conventional enhancement is where a lot of the ethical discussion takes place. So stuff like gene editing, nootropic drugs, neural implants, that kind of thing. So with that in mind, I want to start with you, Lílian, if that's okay. So you argue, and correct me if I'm wrong with any of this, that the traditional therapy enhancement distinction is misguided, and you propose what you call a proportionality framework in your recent Springer book as an alternative. So I thought you could just start by kind of walking the audience through what that alternative is and how it's implemented in practice.
Thank you, Cody. And thank you for the invitation, for being here, Stephen and James especially. Well, I think I have to explain a bit of my background and why I get to the importance of finding a new framework, right? I come from a very Catholic background, let's say a very traditional ethics, virtual ethics background. And also my work at the UNESCO, chairing bioethics and human rights, and the aim of involving the stakeholders, governing technology. I identify this extreme caution, I should say, in front of enhancement technologies, or even emerging technologies when they go beyond therapy. In practice, though, this was not easy or clear or, I dare say, useful for governance. We had this fuzzy gray line or definitions, and I think I should start there with the definition of enhancement, because we use the same words to define very different realities. Sometimes we talk about enhancement to go beyond a trait that I have as an individual. Sometimes we talk about enhancement of the species, and even using traits for other species to enhance or change the human species. Sometimes enhancement is the interface of human and machines trying to enhance performance. But if you get the idea of using technology for improving an average trait, you realize that you use enhancement in so many things in our daily lives, and in medical history too, no? Prostheses. We talk about cosmetics being cosmetic surgery or a cosmetic cream, something very simple, whitening the teeth. I'm going very low with the examples here, but just to realize that I came to the conclusion that in my circle, we're using this extreme caution against enhancement and not being very honest, I'd say, or it was not really working. The solution many times was going against the desire of improving, or yes, the desire of improving and the concrete improvements, and then in daily lives we are using technology to improve our quality of life and also our health, our own bodies, ourselves, right? Without going too far of changing nature or immortality. I'm not talking about very extreme examples that entered the dialogue as well in enhancement, but said, okay, it's not as easy as saying therapy as well, going back to the normal, average stage of life is fine, and then all enhancements, all improvements are morally bad, because that does not seem to be the case in human history and in medical history. And we don't want to destroy medicine, and we don't want to destroy our history in progress. We have to find a way to judge and to guide, more than judge, because just saying this yes, this no, right? And I think ethics and bioethics has more to be this kind of steering wheel than the stop sign, don't do this, don't do that. It's necessary sometimes. We don't want to go back to examples of clearly irrespecting human history in medicine, like the test of human subjects without their consent, for example, in concentration camps. And at the same time, we have to find guidance that are more concrete and go beyond respect human nature or human dignity. We use that a lot in UNESCO declarations, right? In the UNESCO Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, the UNESCO Declaration on the Human Genome, Universal Declaration on Human Rights. But when you have to judge in the concrete situation, you need more guidance. And there are such to think, okay, I have to stop from the beginning and see if enhancement is intrinsically bad. If it's not, as assuming it was not, but then I used the very classical framework of object and circumstances. Let's do this analysis in enhancement in general to see if it's inherently bad. If it's not, we have to find conditions for good enhancements, no? Because it doesn't mean that all of them are bad or all of them are good. You have to go concrete, and you need guidance in this. And doing this analysis, basically saw that the end of improvement is not always bad, but that's only a superficial objective. And in human enhancement, then you have deeper levels in the end. You might want to enhance someone for being better than others, for competition, or for military uses, or for sports, or for just a personal satisfaction, a preference, which is not always bad, right? But we have to identify the surface and now the deep level of the ends, the objectives, the goals. Supposing that these goals are good, let's go to the other level, the circumstances. In the bioethical debates, in the bioethical literature, you find lots about the circumstances of enhancement and lots against it because of the danger of discrimination, the danger of eugenics, the danger of increasing inequality, the lack of liberty, being the implicit liberty or explicit liberty. No, you might have the implicit coercion and social coercion and economic coercion, or you might have the very direct coercion of a dictatorship, for example. But yet, these were all circumstantial. Let's suppose that they could be solved by good governance or by virtuous individuals. No, they are not always bad. So let's suppose a situation, theoretically, where these circumstances are all good, okay? Where the dangers are minimized and you have a more social structure that helps with the circumstances. Then you go to the last and more difficult level, which is the object, no? The object, which implies the intervention itself and the means you use for the intervention, right? And there's a lot of necessity for prudence. Prudence not in the sense of caution only, which is part of prudence, but prudence in the sense of finding the right means for each action. So you might have the same objective, let's name it improving the musical capacity of a child. And you can use different means for that. You can put the mother to listen to Mozart for babies, on, and supposedly it enhances the musical capacity. Let's hypothesize here the use of drugs for that. Let's hypothesize here the use of genome editing in the utero, okay? Or even genome editing before the implantation, genome editing in the embryo, changing some genes, aiming at improving musical capacity. Well, the goal is the same, but you clearly have different means with different risks for both mother and child. What do? You go against the desire for improving musical capacity, and you say it's bad, and you say you have to accept the natural talents that the child comes with. No, because then you put the child to piano classes, or you also interfere and intervene with education and technology later on. And said, okay, it's not that the means are always bad, sometimes they are disproportional to the aim or the level of necessity we have. So let's imagine something as simple today as a heart transplantation, right? You can do it for survival. No one will deny it. The doctors do it every day, thousands of heart transplantations every day. But let's imagine that someone arrives and asks for a heart transplantation to improve the strength and be a faster runner. Mm-hmm. So then you say, no, please don't put your health at risk for this mean, because the level of necessity is lower than keeping you alive. So
you have to balance between the risk of an intervention and the necessity of the intervention.
Exactly.
Getting the proportion between the two.
Exactly. And I guess Anders wants to talk because it just...
I think I like this framework. It's just the word necessity. There are some people who do body modifications to look differently. Some do it just for cosmetic purposes. Some want to do a bit of self-expression, maybe a tattoo. And some people tattoo themselves with scales all over the body, sharpen the teeth, split the tongue, add horns, and look like a lizard. Was that necessary? Well, in the case of the lizard man, he actually was inspired as a philosophy student by reading Wittgenstein and wanted to break the family resemblance to humanity. And you could argue that that's not a necessary way of understanding Wittgenstein, to tattoo yourself and turning into a lizard. Yet, to many people who do this kind of very extreme transformation, it's actually a deeply important thing to them. I don't know exactly about the lizard man, it might have been more philosophical there, but there are others who say, I'm using this to express who I truly am. To them, is it necessary, or is it at least deep enough that it might be proportional? And I do think that it might actually be proportional for them. But it wouldn't be proportional for me, because I'm kind of happy to just read Wittgenstein instead. Mm-hmm. So I wonder how much is done by necessity here.
Exactly. So that was an important part of the work when I said necessity. It can mean different things, right? And we probably have not only necessities and no necessities, but rather different levels of necessity. And I built on the work of Maslow, Abraham Maslow, psychologist, American psychologist, that works on the pyramid, or in his theory of motivation. He talks about different levels of necessity, from biological necessities to self-expression. So I'm not going over all the levels here, but starting with, if you don't have water, you die within days. But then you can survive a bit more with not having your preference in self-expression, right? Intermediate levels, for example, are the social levels, the belongingness, the need for belonging there. So I basically worked on level of necessities in health, or kind of trying to apply them more to this enhancement and proportionality, going from health preservation, health prevention, and going down to functional improvements, because some things are objective improvements of performance, and then to preferences, okay, with some of the examples you just gave here. So it's not that they are not a necessity, because I consider self-expression as a necessity, but not in the same level as survival or as prevention, for example.
And you're also talking about the importance of the means of the intervention. I think that connects to some of your work, Massimo, where, and correct me if this is a misreading of your work, but at least in the Topoi article of yours that I was reading, the enhancement therapy debate isn't where a lot of the moral action is, but it's the means of the intervention. And does the intervention bypass rational agency, or is it consistent with rational agency? And that's kind of the more operative question that we should be focusing on. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yeah, it is. And can I comment on the previous question? On the topic of the distinction between the venerable, perhaps, and traditional decision between therapy and enhancement. And today, it has become very fashionable, of course, to say that the distinction is impossible to trace and it is morally useless. I'm not really convinced about that. I mean, there are serious reasons in favor of the two views. However, as for the conceptual distinction, I guess that there is a possibility to trace the distinction. I mean, the fact that there are gray cases or gray areas, as you mentioned before, is of course true. And the fact that you can use, for example, one technology for therapy reasons or for enhancement reasons is of course true. But this does not mean that you cannot distinguish cases which are clearly therapeutical and cases which are clearly enhancement cases. Of course, there is the gray area, and this is a problem. It's okay. But I guess there is this possibility. I mean, it's just the same as, you know, at dawn you cannot decide whether it's night or day, but there is a moment in which it's clearly night, and there is a moment in which it's clearly day. There are a few minutes or hours, perhaps, in which it's controversial whether it's night or day, but this does not remove the distinction. Now, you can say, okay, even if you accept that we can trace the distinction, so what? Because it has no moral import at all. I'm not convinced about that, too. There is at least one important job, I guess, that the distinction can use and may be put to use, and has to do perhaps with something that is tied to the necessity, I would say to the importance, the moral importance. So this is not a conceptual issue, but a moral one, the moral importance that we tie to certain interventions. I mean, the greater moral importance should go to therapeutic interventions and lesser moral importance. I don't mean that this distinguishes between what is morally acceptable and morally objectionable. It's clear that there are, of course, there are enhancement interventions which are not morally objectionable, but perhaps there are some that are. And, but this may help us, from the morally speaking, to distinguish between the relevance or the importance or the urgency. And this has particular relevance, at least from my own point of view, when it comes to, for example, funding research or funding treatment for therapy reasons or enhancement reasons. I mean, particularly, of course, in public systems such as one we have in several European states, including Italy, it's clear that priority should go to therapies rather than to enhancement. And also at a macro level, so to say, of course, there is no world authority that decides where the funding goes, but in those situations where you can decide at the macro level in which directions to push scientific research, I guess that there are important issues as far as therapeutic needs are concerned that are still unmet needs, and these deserve, morally speaking and perhaps politically speaking, so to say, and within perhaps the framework of human rights, I mean, it's much more important to provide certain therapies which we fail to provide in certain areas of the world than it is to move on concerning research on enhancements. So this shows, at least in my view, that there is a role for the distinction, the traditional distinction, even if I accept the point, it's not that clearly traceable. and second, it's not in itself a distinction between right or wrong, or the acceptable or the unacceptable. And then to go back to your question very briefly, yes, my point is especially critical. I'm particularly critical concerning moral enhancement. I have much less moral problems with other forms of enhancement, for example, cognitive enhancements. Why? And I guess that, of course, there is one general question which concerns everything in science and in medicine, which has to do with safety, of course. But let's assume that the safety issue is okay, and let's also assume that the effectiveness is okay. And I'm a bit skeptical about, for example, cognitive enhancers, but anyway. Perhaps in the future we will have better ones. But what is what are the cognitive enhancements doing? Basically, if and when they succeed, they help you doing what you are already doing. I mean, you are already working, reading, and studying hard, and calculating, and arguing, and weighing reasons, and whatever. There is nothing new and nothing different from that will come from cognitive enhancers. I mean, cognitive enhancers will not tell you what you have to believe. They will simply raise your capacities to reach conclusions. They will simply raise your capacities to weigh arguments. They will simply raise your capacities to enter into different fields of research, for example, and be much more smart in doing that. Whereas it seems to me it might be a little different for moral enhancement, particularly in the way it has been hypothesized by defenders of moral enhancement in recent decades, that is, acting on the neural basis of moral judgment, moral decisions, and moral actions. Acting on your capacities to feel something, acting on your emotions. It may have a direct impact on your decisions and actions, meaning that you're not really doing what you were already doing. That is, in the best of cases, weighing moral reasons in favor or against a certain proposed actions, and expressing, so to say, your character by being more sensible to a certain kind of reason, more sensible to perhaps certain kinds of sentiments or emotions towards other people, and so expressing your moral agency, moral autonomy in the process of decision-making. Whereas it seems to me that moral enhancement, at least if it is realized or implemented in the way that it has been proposed by people such as Douglas, Savulescu, and others, it seems to me that it is directly working on the neural basis of this process. So it's directly affecting your own capacity to weigh reasons, for example, by, for example, removing your susceptibility, is that the word? Yeah, to a certain emotion, perhaps flattening your emotions. I mean, for example, erasing violent emotions may be good things in certain circumstances, but not necessarily so. And therefore, this means, in a sense, bypassing your moral capacities. I mean, it's not strengthening your capacities to weigh reasons, to be sensitive to certain elements of the situations or of the people involved, so that you have a good reaction, a positive reaction. But it's much more like pushing you into doing something. And of course there is the other topic, but perhaps I've been already too long, and so I just hint at that. The other topic is that it's not clear whether defenders of moral enhancement are wishing to accept that people should be simply free to autonomously choose to whether or not to enhance themselves. At least in certain proposals, of course, it has been proposed that some sort of coercion should be exerted on people into doing that, because we have huge problems, macro problems at the world level, and we cannot solve these problems such as climate change or whatever unless we embark on a very large, a very wide project of enhancing people.
Yeah, so I want to talk more about the governance aspects of enhancement. I want to make sure we have time for that. Before we get there, one other distinction that I just thought might be productive to get on the table, which Anders suggested in an email, is the distinction between enhancement and extension. There's a lot of work in the philosophy of mind and cognitive science on the extended mind thesis, which derives from Andy Clark and David Chalmers, the idea that external tools can actually be literal extensions of your mind. And so I thought you could just maybe offer a few thoughts on that before we get into the governance stuff. The idea of enhancement improving existing capacities versus cognitive extension actually adding new foreign capacities to your mind that didn't previously exist, and whether that distinction makes the traditional therapy enhancement distinction less useful in some way.
So I think one can distinguish between two kinds of extension, although they overlap here. One is extension in the sense of not just taking an existing capacity we have, but adding an entirely new one. If I can start seeing in ultraviolet light, for example, that is not a property normal people or any person actually has. I'm adding an entirely new potential. And then there is the extension in the second sense with the Clark and Chalmers thing. Extending my mind outwards, putting parts of my mind out there, maybe making collective mind. And obviously, they overlap to a great deal. As a team, if I have an extended cognitive ability, I gain some abilities, or the team might have abilities, that is not in any of the individual minds. The ultraviolet light sensitivity, or being able to sense magnetic fields, is much more individual. That is how I started thinking about it in terms of enhancement, because it does pose an interesting challenge, for example, to proportionality. It's a bit unclear what it's proportional to, and it's also unclear how to judge how good it is. My friend Todd Huffman was one of the first persons to implant a magnet to sense magnetic fields, and when asked why, he more or less shrugged and said, I want to find out what it is like to sense magnetic fields, which I think is a very valid reason to do this. It involves a small amount of risk, but I think he also made a good proportionality argument that, yeah, he could remove it, he might at worst lose a finger. It's still worth it, at least for him. The problem is, of course, many extensions are very subjective. It's very unclear how good they are going to be for you, especially since before you extend yourself, you might be a different person. This gets, of course, closer to the issue of moral enhancement. If I modify my mind and my decision-making process, maybe afterwards I realize this is great. I should not have hesitated a second. But my previous self would have a valid reason to say, yeah, that change was not a proper change. This might be very hard to resolve, although it's a classic debate, of course, philosophically speaking, and I think we can make headway on that. The interesting thing about the extensions is, of course, that these days we're getting it a lot. Most of us, of course, got our extra brains in our pockets. A fair bit of our cognition is happening accidentally or deliberately in these extended systems. And thanks to AI, this is getting way more enlarged. Enlarged in a lot of different dimensions too, some of which I think represent just an extra functionality. I'm using my AI agent to solve a problem I could have solved, but I'm a bit lazy or I want a second version of it. So I'm just taking that functionality and testing it in an extra case. Sometimes it speeds things up. And sometimes it allows me to do things I couldn't do. When I'm web coding, yeah, I'm a computer scientist. I could have programmed that program, but it would have taken me a week. Now I get it in 15 minutes and can solve a practical problem, and then I can go on and solve another problem. I'm getting a new capacity that way, at the expense, of course, of putting the AI somewhat into my cognitive system. Many of the chatbots, and I guess this is for another panel, are of course trying to put them relatively separate. But I do think that we are extending our minds and sometimes unknowingly taking what Wikipedia or ChatGPT are saying as our thoughts, which I think can be a real problem if we're not careful about it. But the treatment enhancement distinction get complicated here because teeth whitening and moral enhancement and becoming a cyborg are very different things. We tend in this debate to start out with the unobjectionable cases and showing there is no real border here. And I think that is accurate. I think that's an important thing because many people who haven't considered it tend to assume that there is a clear black and white border. No, it's a dawn. It's a gradual shading from darkness to light in whatever direction you want to go here. And that border might also not align with the border between permissible and impermissible. In fact, they're kind of separate things. There are many medical treatments that I think are impermissible or unadvisable or just a bad idea, even though they're proper medicine. And similarly, these extensions blur things further. But this blurriness is not really a problem. I liked the way you laid out that framework with these three parts, because that allows us to reason about it. Just because something is in this border zone, this dawn, doesn't mean that we can give up on it. In fact, that's where we get the most benefit from thinking clearly.
Yes, thank you, Anders. I think we can drag from the example of your friend and the sensibility for the magnetic fields, right? First, in the judgment, we judge with the best information we have available. And that's already a limitation, but we act with this all the time, right? Think, for instance, COVID decisions. We may look back now and say, oh, this government took the wrong decision. Right, but did he or she know at the time all the information we have now to, from far away in years later, go back and judge him? So maybe he took the wrong practical decision, but it was not the morally wrong decision, because within the information he had at hand, that was the best course of action. So let's suppose your friend took the best course of action with the information he had available about the efficiency of the means. Efficiency in the sense that this will work, will give him the ability he's aiming at, and also that the benefits outweigh the risks. So let's say yes. And then along the way, so let's say yes, it's proportional, the level of necessity, which is a preference, a curiosity, valid curiosity. Let's see how the human acts and interacts with this experience or this capacity. And then along the way, let's suppose he find out other effects or think it's affecting his psychology or his capacity to sleep. I don't know. No, let's just invent here some consequence. And he said, so it's not proportional anymore. It's causing me some unforeseen damage that it's not convenient for me anymore to try this new capacity or trait. In your case, you also said, oh, it's reversible. Excellent idea, because you can go back and you can stop it. So it's a part of the informed consent that you can withdraw from the consent you gave at any time in the process. So that's kind of an easy example where you can see proportionality at the beginning. During the intervention, you can also change if you see the proportionality logic is not following. It's quite more difficult with interventions that are irreversible. If you think of genetic intervention that affects future generations and you cannot erase it from humanity once you do the heritable human genome editing. So then if you see that, oh, this is not working as expected, or it was actually a mistake, or the risks now are clearly higher than the benefits, it's not as easy, right? You won't kill this person, you won't forbid this person to have children, so it's much more delicate. In that sense, proportionality is not only about the level of necessity, but also about the risk levels, which have many variables, and that I completely agree. The variables can have to do with the technological development, the amount of means, the timing, and they're variable there. And yet I find the logic of proportionality very useful, even for the case of our friends.
There is a small thing here that might also bridge over to the governance question that's interesting. Doing that kind of exploration might tell the rest of us whether this is a good idea. So even if Todd found out that, oh no, it disrupts my sleep, this is bad for me, and even if it was irreversible, the rest of us would learn something like, don't do that, that is a bad idea. And I think many forms of enhancement, and this goes especially for various forms of extensions, might be a useful exploration where some people are taking a risk but actually bringing knowledge to the rest of humanity. And that creates an interesting obligation. We might say, as a kind of social contract, that it's great that some artists, some transhumanist explorers, some psychonauts try these things, expand the space what humans have experienced, and can tell us about it. And sometimes that's going to fail. Sometimes that's going to be a horribly bad idea. And then in exchange for that knowledge, we're also going to treat you. So we have healthcare system. We are going to actually say, yep, that was a stupid thing you did, but we're going to put you in the hospital properly. I think there is a kind of contract we could imagine for especially the explorative aspect of enhancement. It's a very different thing for the practical thing. Should we be putting moral enhancement drugs in the drinking water? That's kind of applying them in a particular way. That's a very different social contract. But the explorative side, I do think that there is this deal between the explorer and society that wants to learn something.
I think it's very connected to the regulations for clinical trials, for example. We expect humanity to learn from the clinical trials, even if they might go wrong, right, with human subjects. But they are there, the regulations we have today, exactly because there were moments in history where the knowledge, the possible knowledge, was used as an excuse to exploit people, right, to make clinical research on human beings in an unethical way. So we have lost today, to say, the curiosity or the valid and loweable aiming of let's get to see what happened here, and let's advance knowledge is a good thing, but you can't do this at any cost. You can't do this at the cost of the subject. In there, the proportionality reason enters again, how much you put in this, you can foresee a proportional risk in the situation or not. Right.
Another concept, and I do want to move on to governance, and we'll start with Massimo, but L.A. Paul has this notion of transformative experiences, which are experiences that one can undergo, but you can't anticipate going into it, how it's going to epistemically or personally transform you. And so I had that in mind as you were talking about these psychonauts exploring at the frontier with limited information. And I do think there's an important question about, is it even possible to meaningfully consent to these kinds of transformative experiences in the context of enhancements? Moving now more squarely into the governance discussion, and I'll direct this one at you, Massimo. I guess the question here is just, well, you can offer your general governance thoughts, but do you think existing institutions are equipped to keep pace with the speed of enhancement technologies? Do we need entirely new institutions? I want to bring up the WHO with Lílian and her work on that. Any thoughts on that, or the governance in general, which we started remarking upon in your last remarks?
So the question exactly is whether we need
new
institutions
to keep pace with the exponential pace of enhancement technology.
Yeah, perhaps following what Anders was saying, perhaps yes. I mean, as she said, perhaps we need a new sort of area of research, of new sort of way of doing trials that can meet those desires for exploring new things, because we have a general institutionalized way of doing research for medical purposes, and in that case you need a very you have a very clear structure. For example, institutional review boards. You need to have a ratio of risk and benefits which is very clearly defined. You need to have also the statistical numbers. I mean, you need to have many patients and in order to run controlled trials. So it's much complicated, and the procedures for informed consent are particularly well defined. So in that case, we would need some sort of different way of organizing research, because here, in that case, you know, everything is much more difficult to say in advance whether you have what are the risks and benefits. It is perhaps much more difficult to have preclinical research, and so in order to grant the possibility of doing this research, you should devise a different structure of accepting and validating trials. I mean, only self-selected people, for example, coming from the transhumanist movement, and different ways of providing informed consent, and only perhaps funding from devoted institutions which are specifically devoted to that, and perhaps not to other issues such as standard research for therapeutical goals. And I guess it's a possibility. I mean, it is very interesting. Your distinction is very interesting between the two forms of extension, and it is particularly interesting to explore the possibility of the extension in your first sense, perhaps, that is something entirely new, having an entirely new capacity which is not possible for humans as now they are. And I perhaps would be more, I might have some reservations concerning your extension in the second meaning. I mean, of course, you said we have extensions because this is an extension, but just as books were extensions, and before that, what was before books, and so in that broad sense, everything is an extension. But perhaps you have in mind different sorts of extension. I mean, for example, mind uploading or that sort of things. And in this case, I guess that we have, I'm not sure if it's proportionality or what, but there is another element that enters into the picture and must be taken into account. Which is the level of exit from the domain of biology and embodiment of humans. That is, how much you undergo forms of hybridation with machineries, and this might have some additional risk as compared perhaps to the example that you do that you made of your friend, this might be an additional risk in that it would mean moving from the biological standard condition that is standard for humans to a different sort of condition which is not entirely biological, or perhaps mainly not biological because of all the elements, the technological elements that you have, so to say, within your identity, that affects your identity. So this distinction is very important, and I guess that there should be differential treatment between the two cases, or at least this is my intuitive reaction.
It's actually interesting to notice that we have very careful rules about medical experimentation and scientific experimentation. All the forms of enhancement that are not extension are usually falling under that, except of course that when the method is different, like transcranial magnetic stimulation, then it's falling outside a little bit of those regulatory systems, but generally they can move in and grab it. Meanwhile, the extensions we get in the form of the apps and systems on these ones are totally unregulated. In fact, we have blundered into a world where we are having all sorts of very radical experiments with the kind of collective extensions of our minds, with all sorts of more positive and negative results. But because it came from a very different domain, we have a very different regulatory regime, essentially nothing. Only if you start making a psychological claim about your app, then suddenly you might be making a medical device. Just getting back to inventing new institutions, I think academia is of course in a crisis. It's always been in a crisis. That's kind of one of the best things. But I think it's in a particularly tense crisis right now. And one of the best things that is happening is that people are also inventing new kinds of institutions, like focused research organizations, and a lot of other abbreviations I cannot remember right now. The interesting part here might be that we could also do a lot of exploration, experimentation with new ways of setting up institutions for this. Again, I think we might discover that many of them are not fit for purpose. They're not going to work well practically or economically or ethically, but that's again something we need to do. We have good institutions for particular purposes, but we probably need to invent more.
Can I? Talking about that we have good regulation for medical research today, we have this today for historical reasons, right? It was not always the case. It's the case now because historical disasters. And I think we have to wait and see if that will be also the case with enhancement technologies, if they cause a social disaster or historical crisis. They probably will be heavily regulated in the future, or all the technology that we are commonly used to. We are at the very beginning of this, and there seems not to be a use for very structured regulation for this today, but it might be the case in the future. I don't know how
I think it's very likely. Typically you see a new domain showing up, people trying a lot of things. Things go well, things go badly. Eventually we're regulated. And it's not just the regulation in the traditional legal and ethical form, it's also setting up standards. If you think about how computers were in the early 1980s, eventually we ended up with a lot of PCs and Apples. Eventually the diversity disappeared, which some of us are nostalgic about, but at the same time it's also a kind of practical dynamics. The real problem might be, of course, if we regulate things too heavily. So right now, making a new social medium is unregulated. And I can imagine some people saying, no, actually, a future where you strongly regulate that sounds good. But what about art? There are performance artists who do things that are bordering on enhancement, or like Stellark and Orlan. Should we say, no, you need Stellark, you need ethics approval for that art project? And most people would say, no, it would be wrong to regulate art like that. Mm-hmm. And it might also be wrong to regulate people's ability to invent a new medium. But these political discourses have to happen. It's not going. I might take a very libertarian view, but I still think that we should still have them. We need to have good arguments why I'm allowed to write any kind of software I want, and why that's an important part of my freedom of expression, etc. It's not just that we should blithely assume that let people write and do whatever we want. We are eventually always going to converge towards something that more or less works, and then we better push it so it works better, because I think medical regulations are too heavy-handed right now.
I think you addressed one question that I wanted to ask you, Anders, and that's you've written a lot on the concept of morphological freedom, the idea that you have a right to modify your body via enhancements, but you've also written a lot on technological existential risk and the need for collective governance, and there's a kind of prima facie tension there, and so I think you partially just addressed that, but I don't know if you want to say anything else.
Generally, of course, most forms of human enhancement are unlikely to lead to a really big global disaster. It might be an individual disaster for some people, but it's unlikely to be the kind of existential threat that requires really strong global coordination against it. But of course, morphological freedom is a right that comes around in the same way as other rights. And of course, one can debate endlessly what rights are, or even if they are something. But they're often in tension to each other. There is both a positive versus negative aspect of morphological freedom. Maybe I'm allowed to modify myself, but should you guys have to pay for that? What if I end up in the hospital? But there is also the issues about the various forms of other rights, like freedom of expression, might still run into the people that don't want to hear particular forms of freedom of expression and hate speech, etc. So rights always end up with interesting constraints, whether that is, can I actually consent to a modification of my motivation system? There is that age-old liberal argument that you can't sell yourself into slavery, so maybe you can't validly modify your frontal lobe so you no longer have a free will. So I do think morphological freedom is a very important and rather central right. But it's always kind of butting up against the other rights. And that's, of course, always what happens with rights in practice. I assume that you have a lot more nuanced views on how rights work, given where you're coming from.
Could I just add on to that, because I'm mindful of the time? So feel free to answer that question. But another question that I just wanted to make sure I asked you, Lílian, is in your book you did a detailed analysis of the 2021 WHO Global Governance Framework on Genome Editing. And so I'm curious, where is it wanting? And also, one thing that stood out to me is there's striking similarities between assumptions and claims in transhumanist documents and in that WHO framework. And so I just wonder what you make of that. Does that mean, is the WHO framework contaminated with transhumanist assumptions, or is there just more agreement on both sides than both sides have recognized?
Yes, thank you. So this was a 6-year research when I applied a methodology from social sciences called reflexive thematic analysis, made to find common themes or patterns within different data sets. So I took 3 documents from the transhumanist website, the Humanity Plus website. I thought transhumanism was very vast and with difference amongst the transhumanists, and I was trying to find documents that at least had the convergences amongst them, and so I took the manifesto, the declaration, and the frequent asked questions. And on the other hand, I took the WHO, back then recently published, framework for governance of human genome editing. This is a set of 3 documents, okay? So the framework, the recommendations, and a position paper. Trying to address a very specific question, that's one that the transhumanists also talked a lot about, human genome editing. There were a lot of developments in the technological field with CRISPR and then Prime for human genome editing. So with this methodology that has 6 steps, and basically you code every sentence of the 2 documents, label them, classify, analyze, and there are screening questions for each of the steps. At the end, I worked with 3 broad common themes or patterns, and enhancement was one of them. It doesn't mean the WHO agrees with the transhumanist documents in on the definition of enhancement or in the moral judgment of enhancement. No, it's just that WHO couldn't ignore the topic, right? And it appears in different moments of the document, document of global governance, of human genome editing. So I guess it goes back to your question, do we need new institutions? Of course, new institutions are welcome if they are well organized and they do their purpose. But it can't mean that the old institutions can wash their hands and not deal with our present issues and problems. So it's also one of the expressions of the framework for governance, the WHO framework for governance, that governance must be proactive, not only reactive, right? You can update the governance later, but it's better try to accompany something that's not only regulating about, it's not governance in the sense of jumping with some rules without we even know what this technology does. That can be very unproductive. But governance in the sense of the complex process where you take into account research, patents, copyright, funding, social debate, the previous human rights framework, different means in different agents in the process, and you try to figure out a good way at the beginning of accompanying the development of the technology. So it's not only that we have absolutely clarity and we regulate it if yes or no, it's more the process, and that's why it's a framework and not a treaty, for example. It's not a declaration or a treaty. And I think it's important for WHO, for UNESCO, for the United Nations and different institutions or ministries of health in the country to engage with these problems, because otherwise we leave us, if they are not at the door, and they are. We might not call them enhancements, but we are given the choice sometimes in our lives, or we hear of friends putting chips in their hands or doing kind of the little enhancements available in our daily life. So I do think these institutions, regardless if we have new institutions taking care of it, we also need the old institutions engaging with the dialogue, and I think the WHO did that. At least it's clear that they are not ignoring the issue in human genome editing.
Well, I think that's a good place to end. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists.